Wijnand, you could start. Johan, you'll see a comment from Josefa in the meeting chat, so you might want to just try and have a read of that and respond to her question. But while we're getting Wijnand set up, I'll give an introduction, although he may not need one, really. He's an experimental social psychologist specializing in emotion. He did his undergrad and master's in the Tilburg University. I'm not sure there's any relation there, Wijnand, but before then doing a PhD at the University of Limerick. He's currently senior lecturer at the University of Essex, has published over 100 peer-reviewed articles and book chapters, many of which are about boredom. And many of you may also know that he's Vice Secretary of the International Society of Boredom Studies. In his blurb, I'd like to point out that he claims, and I'm going to quote here, that he loves teaching statistics to the utter boredom of his students. I'm sure that they're not bored, but he's going to tell us today about how nature adds colour to life, less boredom in natural versus artificial environments. Take it away, Wijnand.
Right, thank you, James, for your lovely introduction. You can hear me and see my screen, I assume, right? Otherwise, you shout.
We can.
Or something. Okay, great. So I'm going to present you some very recently published work that we did on boredom and one potential remedy to it. And this work is done with my collaborators, Marian, Elisa, Eric, Jason, and Isabel, as you can see there. I've tried to make this all nature themed because obviously the message will be that nature is good for you. Here, all right. Oh, and we were funded too by some organizations. They didn't fund this research. We just used their money for this project. As is, I think, common. So first, let me just start off with a definition. So we're very boring here. We define it using John Eastwood's quite old now definition of boredom. We see boredom as the averse experience of wanting but being unable to engage in satisfying activity. And just to set the stage here, because we had some philosophical talks earlier this morning, we're really looking at the momentary experience of boredom. That's what we hope to understand. So not boredom with life or so, or some very broad existential sense of boredom, but really this momentary experience, which I think lines up pretty well with the previous talk. As you probably know, there are some potential positive outcomes of boredom, but across the board, boredom is associated with a lot of negative things. I've just put a list here that this is very, very short list. There are far more things here. And just to pick out some, so we know boredom is associated with depression, suicidal ideation. It's associated with pathological gambling, hostility. There's this paper where it's shown that boredom is associated with being more willing to shred worms as an indication of sadism. And so generally, there are a lot of negative things associated with boredom, despite its potential to have perhaps some positive impacts here and there. So this is something that's worrisome. On the other hand, we also know that not only boredom is problematic, but also that it is a common experience. So there's this fantastic paper by Chin and colleagues called Bored in the USA. I wish I had come up with that title, where they scoped the occurrence of boredom in US society, and they found that about 3% of any 30-minute periods in waking hours, people are not bored when they're asleep, presumably, is characterized by boredom. That if you extrapolate that over an 80-year life, that's about 3 years of boredom, which I think is quite daunting, to be honest. They found particular groups are more vulnerable, young people, young men, unmarried young men, and in particular, unmarried young men with low income, but even these separate groups are. And I'll tell you a little bit more about the low income group here, because I think there is some particular relevance to the studies here. So its occurrence is frequent, and there are not many meta-analyses on boredom to see if it's increasing, or longitudinal studies, but there are a few. So, for example, Gu and colleagues, and Wainwright and colleagues, they have found that at least in some societies, boredom seems to be on the rise, and so it's probably something we have to be aware of. And there are lots of scholars who speculate or theorize that boredom is in fact increasing, perhaps in part due to the role of smartphones, for example. All right, so boredom is a problem. It occurs often, and it's on the rise. So that means that as psychologists, we're typically interested in finding some sort of solutions, or at least understanding the causes of boredom. Now, there are lots of causes of boredom, or predictors of boredom. So I won't review them all, but a common theme among these focuses on the causes of boredom are that they look at the individual as a source. So for example, people are introverted, maybe more bored. People who have low self-control may be more likely to get bored. People who lack a sense of meaning in life are more likely to get bored. People who lack a sense of control or value in their activities at work or at school may be more likely to be bored. Now, that's important. It helps us to get a sense of who is more likely to get bored, but it also puts the onus on the individual to deal with that. And indeed, remedies for boredom tend to focus on the individual as well. So, for example, we know that nostalgia helps to alleviate boredom momentarily, but that requires an individual to become nostalgic. Self-transcending affect like awe, gratitude reduces boredom. Again, relies on the individual to become, to have this state of affect. Some more applied work in education by Katie Tam, but especially Reinhard Pekroen as well, shows that by changing curricular demands, for example, making goals more relatable for students, or changing teacher conduct by having teachers be less boring themselves, that helps. But again, it's very specific to either an individual or a specific situation. So surely there must be ways to address boredom more generally, given that it's so widespread, instead of hoping that these individuals take control of their own life and channel their own boredom. If so, that would be nice. And we hope to do that by focusing on something that everyone is affected by, and that is the living environment. So literally the surroundings in which you live. And I'm going to distinguish between two types, either natural environments or artificial environments. They're not quite a dichotomy. There's a bit of a sliding scale between them, but I'm focusing on these two. And just very briefly to clarify what I mean with these concepts is that natural environments are mostly non-human made, or at least they're not obviously human made. So a park might be created by humans, a forest might be planted by humans, but it's not obvious that is necessarily the case, or at least it contains many features that are not human-made. Artificial environments are the exact opposites, right? It's probably very intuitive. There are things where the elements are human-made, such as buildings, streets, and some agricultural lands where you have, for example, what do you call it, glass houses and stuff like that. So that's the distinction we make. Now, what we propose is that one of these two is more conducive to boredom than the other. In particular, we're arguing that artificial environments invite boredom into our lives, and natural environments potentially have the capacity to reduce it. If so, that's important because so far many remedies to boredom have looked at these individual factors. If we find out that it's the environment itself where we have control over, for example, the amount of nature around us, that might help us address boredom more broadly. All right, so there's some reasons why we might expect that nature versus artificial environments are associated with less boredom. So there's research that shows that natural environments versus artificial ones are more likely to restore attention, right? Or maybe help build our cognitive resources. It also generally is shown that natural environments help increase psychological well-being and life satisfaction. So some general positive effects of nature, maybe boredom is among them. And that sets the stage of boredom as potentially one of the positive outcomes. And we're going to focus on one particular aspect of these natural environments, and that is what we call color vividness. So with color vividness, we mean the brightness, saturation, and contrast that is present in nature as a visual stimulus versus artificial environments. And what we basically say is that brightness and saturation and contrast are higher in natural environment, right, compared to artificial ones. And we know that these features are associated with greater engagement of attentional processes. Attention is typically, a failure to engage attention or to hold attention is typically a feature of boredom. So we expect that nature, by engaging our attention, by being so vivid, might help us to save off boredom. Doesn't mean that that's the only thing that nature does positively to avoid boredom, but it's the one that we focus on here. And we think it's nice to focus on it because it's such a basic feature. And later I'll link it to some implications that it has too. All right. So we conducted a series of studies on this, and I'll start with our first, which is a little field experiment. It's a literal field experiment. So I work at the University of Essex, and our university is famous for being a hallmark of brutalist architecture. And you can see that in the lower picture there, everything is gray. But the interesting thing is that it's situated in an award-winning park. So you have this massive contrast between, unkind concrete structures and then this gorgeous park around it. And we use this to our advantage. So what we did is we, on campus, we approached people and we approached them on the central space on campus and then walked them to one of these locations, either to be surrounded by the park or in the middle of one of these concrete blocks. We didn't tell them that this study was about boredom. We just wanted to hear what their experiences were. And some of the questions included that we asked them while they were being interviewed, so they had a good view of their surroundings on the spot there. We asked them how happy, bored, sad they felt, how much awe they experienced. And we also asked them to evaluate whether surroundings seemed to be vivid to them. Now, importantly, we asked vividness questions afterwards, so we didn't give away that we're studying the impact of vivid environments on their experiences. And what we found, so all these questions are rated on scales. I'm not allowed to call it the visual analog scale. It's a Likert scale from 1 to 7. But I always feel that cognitive psychologists are a bit sneaky by calling these things visual analog scales because it sounds more sophisticated. So next time I'll use a visual analog scale as well. So we have here scores from 1 to 7, and you can see here a little graph where we compare the boredom people reported while being interviewed in a natural versus artificial environment. And remember, these people were not told that we are investigating boredom. They may have guessed, perhaps, but in principle, hopefully at least, they won't be completely aware of that. And you can see that here that there's a difference in the rate of boredom they report. Natural environments significantly less boredom than those in artificial environments. Okay, so that's encouraging. It's a nice little, it's a real environment, so that's always nice to do in psychology. It tells us something about the real environment around us. And for vividness, we see the exact opposite. Natural environments are seen as more vivid than artificial ones. So that's consistent with our reasoning that maybe something to do here about this less boring character of nature is that it's more vivid, but we haven't formally tested it yet. It's just a parallel change. Okay, great. So artificial environments compared to natural ones seems to increase boredom. These are paralleled by more vividness of natural environment, at least subjectively rated. But of course, it's just a snapshot. 2 environments doesn't really generalize to anything. So we want to scale this up properly. So how do you scale things up? That's the next step. We wanted to study boredom in the wild, like as it occurs in society. And we wanted a really large representation of areas. And one technique we have for this, it's far from perfect, but it is quite impressive in scope, at least, is to look at things like social media expressions. So in the second study, what we did is we looked at expressions of boredom that people expressed in tweets. This was not one of the included tweets, but it's a nice example. And then we linked that to data we had about the environment. So how this worked was as follows. We scraped during a couple of weeks an enormous amount of tweets. They were all cleaned. We removed likely bot responses. We removed retweets and things like that. And we selected from the tweets those that had at least some expression of boredom. And the reason why we have to do that is because otherwise you end up with such an insane volume of tweets that are irrelevant that it's going to be very hard to analyze. So all these tweets it contains something associated with boredom, like the word bored or the word dull and so on. We then coded these tweets for the percentage of words they contained that relate to boredom using a dictionary of boredom-related terms. We did the same for sadness, so that later we'll be able to disentangle boredom in particular as an expression versus more general sad or negative expressions. And what we did then, after we had that for in this case, US counties, we correlated those percentages with data about land composition, geographical data that we got through satellite imagery. Now, we don't have a satellite ourselves, but these data are publicly available, so you can collect them yourself. So effectively, we have at the county level in the US, proportions of how much boredom is expressed in tweets and how natural their environment is. Here's a little example of how these tweets are coded. So you see here, for example, there's a long tweet at the start that talks about boredom, loneliness, sick of things. So there's a little bit of boredom in there, one word here, but a lot of the words are not boring, right? Whereas there's some sadness related expressions like loneliness, being sick, these sort of negative terms. Whereas if someone just writes bored, maybe that was Donald Trump actually there, bored, right, with 3 exclamation marks, that's 100% boredom. There's no other negative affect in there. So this is the way these are coded, right? You'll find some tweets where they talk about boredom without necessarily indicating that people are bored themselves. That's an imperfection of this method, right? So take this always with a pinch of salt. Just in case you're interested or curious, we looked at state level boredom proportions in the tweets that we collected. So the most bored state, according to this paradigm at least, is Louisiana in the US. I don't know if we have any US participants, but check your state. All right. It seems to be very low in the north, which is something positive potentially if it generalizes further across the board into Canada. All right, so when we correlate the proportion of boredom in these tweets to the degree to which the environment of that county is natural or not, we find a small, very small negative correlation or negative association. You see here a standardized regression coefficient of about minus 0.0278. That's really, really small. So there's a very small but significant association between how natural your environment is and how much boredom you express in the social media. Interestingly, we control for other things like mobility, the percentage of male versus female Twitterers, I don't know, in that county, median age, sadness of these tweets, and that association remains. Now, this is a very small association, in terms of psychological effects. I think it's still impressive simply because this tweet measures obviously a very, very indirect measure of people's boredom. So, and it affects so many people that I think it's still interesting. Nevertheless, while we find this association between boredom in tweets and the natural environment, it'd be good to test it in a cleaner way. So in the next studies, we move to a lab to get rid of some potential confounds and test it more experimentally. Of course, that comes with the cost of reduced ecological validity. Lab studies are not necessarily directly relatable to the outside world, although we have that initial field study to at least back that up a little bit. So it says here a boring lab study. It was definitely a boring lab study. So it's a relatively small one. We had about 90 participants. These were students. And sorry, that's not true. These were people recruited through MTurk, if I'm not mistaken. And they were randomly assigned to 2 conditions. In one condition, they were shown a series of natural environment images, like there's a couple of them. Yeah. So they watched them for 5 seconds and then simply moved on to the next one. In another condition, we replaced these with pictures of urban environments. These images were not very carefully selected, to be honest. We selected them based on what we thought was a nice representation of various environments. So the validity of that is dubious, and we address that later. But they watched each of these images, and then we simply asked them how bored they were and to what extent they thought the imagery they saw was vivid. And we measured vivid by asking them to rate the brightness, the perceived colorful, the perceived saturation, the perceived contrast of these images, and we gave them short definitions of these things to help them. What we find is basically a replication of that field study there. So what you see here in the graph on the left is that these natural environments are associated with lower feelings of boredom. So people say that they feel less bored after watching these natural pictures. They feel more bored after the urban environments. And then for vividness, you see the opposite. The natural environments were rated as more vivid. Okay, nice. But that's great. So far, it seems that this pattern of nature being less boring seems to hold, and we find that coincides with greater vividness in nature. But we want to test the role of vividness as one potential underlying feature more convincingly, ideally experimentally. And that's what we did in the 4th study, which is also a boring experiment. So what we did here was a bit more intricate. We gave people lots of pictures of urban and natural environments, but we modified them. So here you see a standard picture of some flats. This would be from an urban environment, obviously, or artificial environment. And we created, I would say with Photoshop, but we did it really easily with just increasing saturation and things like that. We modified them. So here's the brighter version of this. Here we have a more saturated version. And here we have a version that's high in contrast. And the idea behind this was the following. If vividness is a feature that makes boredom less in natural environments, then if we increase the vividness of imagery of artificial environments, it should reduce boredom. So the idea here is that these urban environments, these artificial environments, ought to be less boring if they saw the vivid versions of them versus the control versions. And we also showed them natural environments and did the same thing. And the idea there is that because these natural environments are vivid already, manipulating it will probably not have much of an impact. So what happened? Well, participants saw a mixture of I think it was 20 in total images, 10 natural ones, 10 artificial ones, and we randomly presented them with either a more vivid or less vivid image, and vividness was manipulated either as brightness, saturation, or contrast, all selected at random. So different from the previous study, because they saw different environments, we asked them to evaluate how boring the imagery was after each of these images. So you get a large set of data for a various range of combinations of vividness and environment. Here's some examples of natural environments. So we did the same thing there. And here are the results. So the first thing to say is that whether we manipulated brightness, saturation, or contrast doesn't matter. It doesn't interact with anything. So I'm excluding that here from the presentation just to give you a nice, simple graph. And what you find here is that boredom is higher in the artificial environments. That's exactly as we had before. But there's a reduction as soon as we make those more vivid. Natural environments are just not boring at all, right? It's very low on that scale, and manipulating, increasing vividness further doesn't really matter. So its interaction is significant, and it suggests that vividness is at least one of the features that underlies this benefit that nature seems to have, because if we make artificial environments more vivid in colors, it reduces their boredom. Okay, very quickly, last one. We wanted to also know, actually reviewers told us to test, but they had a good point there, whether it's actually artificial environments causing us to be bored or whether it's nature helping us to reduce boredom. So what we did in this one, in this study, which was also larger and was pre-registered, I see here, so here's a slide there. What we did there is we measured boredom before and after we showed them either natural or artificial pictures, and then tested if artificial environments increased boredom or natural environments reduced it. And we did this with a well-validated set of pictures of nature and artificial environments based on a data set that is available for research, and the stimuli are much better here. And what we find is this nice interaction effect that before they enter our experiment, boredom is relatively low. There's no difference between natural and artificial environments. But after watching these images, we see that the artificial environments increase boredom and the natural environments do not. So it seems that specifically these artificial environments living in the city causes us to be more bored. And it's not necessarily the case that nature reduces it. Compared to urban environments, nature is still better for boredom, but it's really the negative impact of these artificial environments that causes boredom here. All right, so natural spaces are less boring. All right. So just to very briefly summarize, we find in the field experiment, nature is less boring. People tweet less about boredom in natural environments. And we see also in the lab that we can replicate this with just photographs. And it looks like part of this effect is at least driven by the vividness that you find in natural versus artificial environments. So just briefly, some implications. I think there are two. I mean, the obvious implication is if we want to reduce boredom in society, we need to introduce more nature. But there's another one, and that is because we know that vividness is one of the underlying features here. What we can do is increase vividness where it's not possible to make to put nature in place. And I have here a picture on the left that shows a doctor or a hospital area for children. You see, that's exactly what they do. They make it more vivid. You may not be able to put a tree there, but at least you can make it less boring by making it colorful. And I would recommend that we do the same sort of things also for adults, because we get bored too. In my case, I get bored all the time. So one very simple implication, just start painting stuff. I think there are more social implications. I've long had a suspicion that less wealthy environments where we know that boredom features a lot, they're more drab, less colorful, less nature. I did a quick Google search and just poor neighborhood. So this is the images that it produces, completely anecdotal. This does not count as a scientific study. I do the same thing for rich neighborhoods, and look at that difference. So Google seems to know that less prosperous environments are less green, and maybe that explains, at least to some degree, why we find more boredom in those areas. And there is indeed some research that suggests that natural environments are indeed more lacking, or at least access to safe natural environments is lacking more in low-income neighborhoods than richer neighborhoods. So maybe as a societal change, it would be nice to at least address that so we can alleviate boredom that is experienced disproportionately by people who are worse off financially. All right, so I want to end with a rude but actually very helpful final message, and that is get out. Get outside, go into nature. Thank you all for your attention. If you want to look up the details of this research, including some additional important tests and all that, then you can find the paper recently published in JAC General. Right, thank you, and happy to take any questions.
Thank you very much, Wijnand, for an excellent presentation. We've probably got room for a couple of questions. I'm going to start off with a tongue-in-cheek one, but if nature, Wijnand, is so restorative and positive for our affect, why are so many horror movies ubiquitously set in a cabin in the woods? And there's a serious part to that tongue-in-cheek question. That is that, and I think it relates to what you said, you showed us last, where the artificial environments, we get more bored. It's not that nature restores us or reverses the boredom. It seems to me that this is an environment goal interaction, is it not?
So I think there's research showing that
you're breaking up a little bit. Your audio.
Let me try again.
Yeah, that's better.
Still okay. Yep. So yeah, I think there's some research showing that natural environments where visibility is limited, so you have foliage right in front of your face, are experienced as less secure. So there probably is a limit. If you have a cabin that is kind of on the beach or so, where you have good visibility, it may be different. So maybe a moderator there. Yeah, surely it will be dependent on. If you're on your own, it will be very different. If you're in a park and it's bright daylight, if it's dark, the vividness will of course also be very low. So yeah, absolutely. You mentioned cabin, right? Being in the cabin itself is of course not particularly natural. So, but it adds things like being confined. There's some interesting work that shows that the outline of vistas, whether that outline is complex or not. So they do some sort of fractal computation on the outline. If you have a very complex outline, people find that aesthetically more pleasing than when you have a simple outline, which might be, for example, a single building line or something like that. So it may be related to that. Yeah, it's an interesting question. We should build a cabin in the wood and send people there. I think Canada is very well suited for this, no?
Sure, absolutely. I don't know if we will even have Confederates in our experiments with chainsaws and masks, but let's say, so we'll move on to Johan and then Mark and Karina. And I think we have to finish with just those three questions to move on.
Thanks for this beautiful talk. Really, really nice data and very interesting. I was wondering, since you showed these manipulations of color in the images and that it has different effects in respect to the vividness. So did you also, or do you think about also testing the effect of different shapes? Because I felt that, of course, having these rectangular building blocks in the artificial environments is really a dominant feature. So what do you think are other features which influence the complexity and the perception of boredom in these images?
A great point. So at some point during this project, we wanted to do it in VR. So we actually got people to visit downtown Tokyo, for example, versus putting them somewhere on a mountain and then look and walk around. So you're not limited by this square frame. The problem was that the technician who helped us with the VR was terrible and has since been fired. So that project never got off the ground, unfortunately. But it is something we're very interested in because obviously we cannot send people outside all the time. I live in the UK. Usually it's not good weather anyway, and virtual reality here, especially if there's some audio associated with that as well, could allow us to make it much more realistic. So yeah, it would be super interesting to look at that. And my suspicion is would be that we get stronger effect because you have nature fully around you, you can walk in it, whereas in this urban space you might feel far more confined.
Thanks,
Mark.
Hi, thanks for the talk. Again, it was really interesting, especially that last bit about the fact that the artificial increases boredom rather than nature decreases. But I was thinking about the second study. See with the tweets, I don't know what time frame that second study was taken, but were you able to grab the tweeted from iPhone, tweeted from PC? Were you able to grab that, or was it too late for
that? I'd have to check the data, but I think it does record the operating system, which gives you a hint. Obviously, it's not foolproof, but it gives us a bit of a hint of where it was tweeted from. But yeah, I mean, totally. Of course, if you're tweeting from a PC, we know it's very likely that people will be in their actual home, whereas if people are not on their phone, they might be traveling. So that is absolutely one of the. I mean, there are many imperfections about this sort of study. There is a lot of noise. We did control for mobility. That's the tracked movement of devices within a county. So we capture to some degree whether or not in that county people move a lot or not. But that won't, it won't be a perfect control. Yeah.
Perfect. Cheers.
Karina.
Yes, thank you for your presentation. I have a question that maybe is a bit off topic, but I still want to ask the question. So if we move this to the internal world, like people that have a mental image that are more vivid or less vivid, there is a variance. So what do you think there would be a link with boredom?
Oh, that's a great question. I mean, we know from boredom research that pretty much anything you measure correlates in some way to boredom. The question is if it's positive or negative. So I don't know. It'd be very interesting. It makes me wonder what happens if you ask people to visualize an environment in their mind. I'd be curious to see if you tell them make it a urban environment versus a natural one. Maybe that actually helps to reduce boredom. Who knows? And if people are very good at getting vivid features in there, presumably is more effective. But I don't know if the ability to create vivid images itself is associated with more or less boredom. I don't know. There may be others who know. So there might be some research on this already.
There's not as far as I know. I think it's a great question about are the boredom prone aphantasic, and we don't really have that answer yet. Maybe Karina's already doing some of that research, in which case she'll scoop me. But that's great. Wijnand, if